When Pastor Donovan called me a crazy old bat in front of the entire congregation, he thought he was silencing me forever. What he didn't know was that I had been the anonymous donor behind their $1 million building fund for the past decade, and I was about to redirect every penny to the Methodist church across the street. My name is Beatrice Calloway, and if you had told me 5 years ago that I would be sitting here, planning the most spectacular act of righteous revenge in the history of Willowbrook Township, I would have laughed and offered you some of my famous lemon bars while gently suggesting you needed more prayer in your life. But here I am, 73 years old, silver-haired, and absolutely furious. Let me tell you how I got here. For 47 years, nearly half a century, I devoted my entire existence to Hillcrest Community Church on Maple Grove Avenue. When my late husband Cornelius and I first walked through those heavy wooden doors in 1977, it was a struggling congregation of barely 50 souls, meeting in what was essentially a converted warehouse with leaky windows and fold-out chairs that creaked every time someone shifted their weight during Pastor Henderson's lengthy sermons. Cornelius had just established his insurance agency, Calloway and Associates, and we were young, hopeful, and eager to find our place in this small community. Willowbrook Township wasn't much back then, just a collection of modest homes, a few local businesses, and farmland stretching as far as the eye could see. The church was the heart of what little social life existed, and Pastor Henderson, God rest his soul, welcomed us with open arms and immediately put us to work. I wasn't just a member of Hillcrest Community Church, I was its beating heart, its backbone, its most devoted servant. While other wives my age were joining garden clubs and bridge circles, I found my calling in service to the Lord through service to His house. Every single Sunday for 47 years, I arrived at that church no later than 7 in the morning, a full 2.5 hours before the 9:30 service began. I had keys to every door, knew where every light switch was located, and could navigate those halls blindfolded. My routine was sacred to me. First, I would unlock the sanctuary and turn on the heating or air conditioning depending on the season. Then I would check the altar area, ensuring the communion table was properly set, the candles were fresh, and the cross was gleaming. The flowers were my specialty. Every week, I would create elaborate arrangements from my own garden, roses from the bushes Cornelius planted for our 10th anniversary, lilies that I'd been cultivating for decades, seasonal blooms that I planned months in advance to ensure the sanctuary always looked like something from a magazine. During Easter, my lily displays drew visitors from 3 counties over. At Christmas, my poinsettia arrangements were so stunning that the local newspaper featured them on the front page in 1995. But the flowers were just the beginning. I single-handedly organized every church potluck dinner, and let me tell you, in a congregation that grew to over 300 families, that was no small feat. I maintained detailed records of who brought what to avoid duplicates, created seating charts to ensure new families were welcomed by established members, and personally cooked enough food to feed an army at every single event. My kitchen became an extension of the church kitchen, my counters permanently stained from decades of preparing casseroles. My freezer constantly stocked with emergency desserts for unexpected fellowship gatherings. The children's Christmas pageant, I wrote the script, designed and sewed every costume, painted the backdrops, and directed the little ones through months of rehearsals. For 30 years, parents in Willowbrook Township knew that if their child was chosen for the Christmas pageant, Mrs. Calloway would transform them into the most angelic shepherds, the most regal wise men, or the most radiant angels they could imagine. I have boxes of thank you cards from parents, some now grandparents themselves, telling me how magical I made their children's Christmas experience. When the church needed a new roof in 1989, I spent 6 months researching contractors, getting quotes, and personally inspecting the work daily to ensure it met my standards. When the ancient furnace finally gave up in the brutal winter of 1993, I was the one who coordinated with heating specialists, arranged for temporary heaters, and made sure the congregation stayed warm while repairs were completed. When the original wooden pews began falling apart in the early 2000s, I researched church furniture suppliers for months, comparing prices and quality until I found the perfect replacements. Every committee Every project, every crisis, I was there. The building fund committee, the missions committee, the fellowship committee, the decorating committee, if it needed doing, Beatrice Calloway was doing it. Other members would volunteer for a year or two, then move on to other interests or get busy with their careers and families, but I remained constant, the unchanging anchor that everyone could depend on. I organized baby showers for new mothers, arranged meals for families dealing with illness or death, visited shut-ins every week with homemade soup and fresh bread. When old Mrs. Patterson broke her hip in 2010, I coordinated a care schedule that ensured she had visitors and help with groceries for 3 months. When the Morrison family lost their house in a fire, I organized a clothing drive and temporary housing that got them back on their feet. My dedication went far beyond the visible acts of service, though. What nobody knew, what I kept as my most precious secret, was the extent of my financial support for Hillcrest Community Church. You see, Cornelius had been more than just successful with his insurance agency. He had been brilliant, while other small business owners in Willowbrook Township struggled to make ends meet. Cornelius had the foresight to diversify his investments, purchase commercial real estate in the neighboring city of Riverside, and build relationships with major corporations that needed comprehensive insurance packages. By the time he passed away 18 years ago, he had built a fortune that neither of us had ever flaunted or even discussed with others. Cornelius had always been a generous man. But he was also private about money. Beatrice, he told me during his final days in Riverside General Hospital, the Lord blessed us with more than we could ever need. Use it wisely, use it quietly, and use it to make His world a little brighter. Those were some of the last coherent words he spoke to me, and I took them as a sacred charge. After Cornelius passed, I discovered that our combined assets totaled just over $3.2 million. For a 70-year-old widow living alone in a modest house on Elm Street, this was an overwhelming responsibility. I had no children of my own. The Lord had never blessed us that way, though we had tried for years and eventually made our peace with His plan. I had a few distant cousins scattered across the country, but we had never been close. The church family at Hillcrest had become my true family, and I decided that this fortune should be used to help them flourish. But I was determined to follow Cornelius's guidance about generosity being a private matter. I had watched too many churches torn apart by conflicts over money, seen too many congregations where the biggest donors wielded their contributions like weapons to get their way. I wanted my gifts to be pure, without any expectation of recognition or influence, so I became Hillcrest Community Church's anonymous guardian angel. It started small, in 2006. When the church was struggling to pay for repairs to the fellowship hall after a water pipe burst, I quietly wrote a check for $15,000 to cover the entire cost. I mailed it with a simple note, from a friend who wants to see God's work continue. Please do not try to identify the donor. Pastor Henderson was so excited during the next Sunday's service, praising God for providing exactly what they needed through a mysterious benefactor. The following year, when the church's old van finally died and they couldn't afford a replacement for the youth group trips, I sent $25,000 with a note specifying it should be used for a new vehicle. Watching the teenagers' faces light up when they saw their brand new 15-passenger van was worth every penny. But those were just the beginning. As I saw how much my anonymous gifts meant to the congregation, how they allowed programs to expand and dreams to become reality, I began giving more substantially. When Pastor Henderson retired in 2008 and the search committee was struggling to attract quality candidates because the salary was too low, I anonymously supplemented the pastoral compensation package with an additional $20,000 per year. This allowed them to hire Pastor Donovan, a young, energetic minister fresh out of seminary who brought new ideas and attracted young families to our aging congregation. The new sanctuary wing that was completed in 2012, I provided $400,000 of the $500,000 needed, allowing the church to expand seating capacity and add the beautiful stained glass windows that now grace the east wall. The congregation raised $100,000. through traditional fundraising, never knowing that their miraculous major donor was sitting right there in the third pew every Sunday, quietly rejoicing in their excitement. The youth center renovation in 2015 that transformed the basement into a modern gathering space with new carpeting, fresh paint, updated lighting, and a complete kitchen. My $180,000 made that possible. The new sound system that finally allowed everyone to hear the sermons clearly, my $25,000. The church van replacement program that ensured they always had reliable transportation for mission trips and youth activities. I've contributed over $75,000 for vehicles over the years. The beautiful landscaping that transformed the church grounds from a patchy lawn with a few scraggly bushes into a showcase of gardens, walking paths, and seasonal displays. I hired the landscaping company myself and paid the $45,000 cost, then arranged for them to tell the church it was donated by an anonymous member who wanted to beautify God's house. All told, over the past 18 years since Cornelius died, I have anonymously donated just over $1.1 million to Hillcrest Community Church, every major improvement, every financial crisis averted. Every program expansion, I was the silent partner making it all possible. And through it all, I remained simply sweet Mrs. Calloway to my fellow congregants, the widow who always brought homemade cookies to Bible study. The lady who could be counted on to help with any project, the faithful member who never missed a service and always had a kind word for everyone. I loved being that person. I loved watching my church family thrive, knowing that I was quietly helping to make their dreams possible while taking no credit. When Pastor Donovan would preach about God's mysterious ways of providing exactly what the church needed. When committee members would marvel at how perfectly timed donations always seemed to appear, when the congregation would sing hymns of gratitude for their beautiful facilities, I would sit in my usual spot in the third pew, singing along with tears of joy in my eyes, knowing that I was serving as God's instrument. But I also loved my role as the visible volunteer. Despite my age, I maintained my energy and enthusiasm for every aspect of church life. I still arrived early every Sunday to arrange flowers and prepare the sanctuary. I still organized every potluck with military precision. I still sewed costumes for the Christmas pageant, though my fingers weren't quite as nimble as they once were. My house on Elm Street became an unofficial extension of the church. My kitchen was constantly busy preparing meals for sick members, baking desserts for fellowship events, or testing new recipes for potluck dinners. My dining room table was perpetually covered with church committee paperwork, craft supplies for children's programs, or materials for whatever project I was organizing. My spare bedroom was filled with decorations for every season and holiday, carefully stored and cataloged so I could transform the church at a moment's notice. The other church ladies, women 30 years younger than me, would often marvel at my energy and dedication. "Beatrice, you put us all to shame," they would say. "How do you manage to do so much?" I would just smile and attribute it to good genes and a strong sense of purpose. If only they knew that purpose also. The youth center renovation in 2015 that transformed the basement into a modern gathering space with new carpeting, fresh paint, updated lighting, and a complete kitchen. My $180,000 made that possible. The new sound system that finally allowed everyone to hear the sermons clearly, my $25,000. The church van replacement program that ensured they always had reliable transportation for mission trips and youth activities. I've contributed over $75,000 for vehicles over the years. The beautiful landscaping that transformed the church grounds from a patchy lawn with a few scraggly bushes into a showcase of gardens, walking paths, and seasonal displays. I hired the landscaping company myself and paid the $45,000 cost, then arranged for them to tell the church it was donated by an anonymous member who wanted to beautify God's house. All told, over the past 18 years since Cornelius died, I have anonymously donated just over $1.1 million to Hillcrest Community Church, every major improvement, every financial crisis averted. Every program expansion, I was the silent partner making it all possible. And through it all, I remained simply sweet Mrs. Calloway to my fellow congregants, the widow who always brought homemade cookies to Bible study, the lady who could be counted on to help with any project, the faithful member who never missed a service and always had a kind word for everyone. I loved being that person. I loved watching my church family thrive, knowing that I was quietly helping to make their dreams possible while taking no credit. When Pastor Donovan would preach about God's mysterious ways of providing exactly what the church needed, when committee members would marvel at how perfectly timed donations always seemed to appear, when the congregation would sing hymns of gratitude for their beautiful facilities, I would sit in my usual spot in the third pew, singing along with tears of joy in my eyes, knowing that I was serving as God's instrument. But I also loved my role as the visible volunteer. Despite my age, I maintained my energy and enthusiasm for every aspect of church life. I still arrived early every Sunday to arrange flowers and prepare the sanctuary. I still organized every potluck with military precision. I still sewed costumes for the Christmas pageant, though my fingers weren't quite as nimble as they once were. My house on Elm Street became an unofficial extension of the church. My kitchen was constantly busy preparing meals for sick members, baking desserts for fellowship events, or testing new recipes for potluck dinners. My dining room table was perpetually covered with church committee paperwork, craft supplies for children's programs, or materials for whatever project I was organizing. My spare bedroom was filled with decorations for every season and holiday, carefully stored and cataloged so I could transform the church at a moment's notice. The other church ladies, women 30 years younger than me, would often marvel at my energy and dedication. "Beatrice, you put us all to shame," they would say. "How do you manage to do so much?" I would just smile and attribute it to good genes and a strong sense of purpose. If only they knew that purpose also came with the financial means to turn every good intention into reality. I thought this beautiful, secret arrangement would continue for the rest of my life. I imagined myself at 80, 90, even 100, still quietly supporting my beloved church family while maintaining my role as their most devoted visible servant. I pictured future generations of children participating in Christmas pageants with costumes I had provided, future families gathering in facilities I had helped build, future congregations worshiping in beauty and comfort that my silent generosity had made possible. I had found the perfect way to honor Cornelius's dying wish, using our wealth quietly to make God's world a little brighter. I was fulfilled, purposeful, and deeply content with my dual role as anonymous benefactor and beloved church grandmother. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly and brutally that contentment could be shattered. What I didn't foresee was that my decades of perfect, selfless service would be thrown back in my face by people who had no idea of the full extent of my sacrifice. What I never imagined was that my fellow church members, people I had supported financially and emotionally for decades, would turn on me with such viciousness that I would question everything I had believed about Christian community and love. But that betrayal was coming, and when it arrived, it would be so shocking, so painful, and so completely unjustified that it would transform sweet Mrs. Calloway into someone I never thought I could be. Someone with the power to make them all very, very sorry for their treatment of me. Someone who was about to teach Hillcrest Community Church the most expensive lesson in gratitude they would ever receive. The stage was set. My 47 years of investment, emotional, physical, and financial, had created the perfect storm. I had the means, the knowledge, and soon I would have the motivation to execute the most spectacular act of righteous revenge that Willowbrook Township had ever witnessed. All I needed was one more betrayal, one final insult, one last demonstration of their ingratitude to push me over the edge. And Pastor Donovan, bless his heart, was about to provide exactly that. The beginning of the end started on what should have been one of the most beautiful Sundays of the year. It was October 15th, 2023, and the autumn leaves were at their peak, painting Willowbrook Township in brilliant oranges, reds, and golds. I had spent the entire previous day preparing special harvest-themed arrangements for the sanctuary, using branches from my own maple trees, chrysanthemums I'd been nurturing since August, and pumpkins I'd carefully selected from Morrison's farm. Just outside town, I arrived at church that morning at my usual time, 7 o'clock sharp, with my arms full of decorations and my heart full of anticipation. The Harvest Festival celebration was always one of my favorite events of the year. It was a time when the entire congregation came together to celebrate God's bounty, share a magnificent potluck feast, and enjoy fellowship activities that brought. I tried to shake off the odd feeling his dismissive behavior had given me and continued with my preparations. By 9 o'clock, other volunteers had begun arriving to help set up for the day's festivities. The new kitchen was bustling with activity as teams of women began preparing the elaborate feast that would follow the morning service. Jonna Morrison, the current president of the Women's Fellowship, had taken charge of coordinating the kitchen activities. Jonna was a woman in her 50s who had joined the church about 8 years ago when her family moved to Willowbrook Township for her husband's job at the regional bank. She was efficient and organized, qualities I had always appreciated, but lately I had noticed a certain coolness in her interactions with me. Mrs. Calloway, Jonna called as I entered the kitchen to check on the progress. We've got everything under control here. You don't need to worry about the food preparation. I was taken aback by her dismissive tone. For 47 years, I had been the unofficial coordinator of every church meal. I knew every dish that would be served, every family's preferences and dietary restrictions, every logistical detail that made these events successful. I'm not worried, I replied gently. I just wanted to see if you needed any help. And to admire how wonderful everything looks in the new kitchen. The new kitchen is certainly beautiful, said Beverly Patterson, another longtime member who was slicing vegetables at the Central Island. It's amazing how these renovations just seem to happen. We're so blessed to have anonymous donors who can fund these improvements. There was something in Beverly's tone that sounded almost resentful, which puzzled me. I had always thought the congregation was grateful for the mysterious benefactor who had made so many improvements possible. Yes, Jean added, not looking up from her preparations, it certainly must be nice to have that kind of money to throw around. Some of us have to actually work for every dollar we contribute to the church. The comment hit me like a physical blow. The implication was clear. Whoever was making these anonymous donations didn't really understand the value of money, didn't appreciate the sacrifices that regular members made to support the church. If only they knew that every dollar of my donations represented years of careful living, of choosing to maintain my modest lifestyle rather than spending lavishly on myself. But I couldn't defend my anonymous giving without revealing my secret. So I simply smiled and said, I'm sure whoever is helping the church understands exactly how valuable these contributions are. The important thing is that we're all working together to serve the Lord. Are we all working together, though? Asked Linda Crawford, a newer member who had joined about 3 years ago. It seems like some people get to swoop in and be the hero with big donations, while others of us do all the actual work of running the church. I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment and confusion. These women had no idea that I had spent countless hours and thousands of dollars making their church lives easier and more beautiful. How could they be resentful of anonymous donations that only helped everyone? I think, I said carefully, that whether someone contributes money or time or both, what matters is that we're all serving with grateful hearts. Grateful hearts, Beverly repeated with a slight laugh. That's easy to say when you don't have to worry about whether you can afford your own contributions. The conversation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. But I was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Pastor Donovan, who entered the kitchen with his usual confident stride. Ladies, everything looks wonderful, he said, surveying the preparations with obvious satisfaction. This is exactly the kind of event that showcases what Hillcrest Community Church is all about. Came together as a family to celebrate God's blessings. Pastor, Jonna said, we were just discussing how blessed we are to have anonymous donors who make improvements like this beautiful kitchen possible. Pastor Donovan's expression grew serious. Yes, about that. I'm actually planning to address the issue of anonymous giving in today's sermon. I think it's time for our congregation to have an honest conversation about stewardship and transparency. My heart began racing. What was he planning to say? anonymous giving was a time-honored tradition in churches. Many of the most generous biblical examples, the widow's mite, the Good Samaritan, emphasize giving without seeking recognition. What kind of conversation? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Well, Pastor Donovan said, looking directly at me, I've been doing some thinking about whether anonymous donations are really in the best interest of the church community. There's something to be said for transparency, for everyone knowing where our resources come from and how decisions are being made. Beverly nodded enthusiastically. I've always wondered about that. How do we know these anonymous donations don't come with strings attached? How do we know the donor isn't trying to influence church decisions from behind the scenes? Exactly, Linda added. And it does create an inequality in the congregation. Some of us are working ourselves to the bone to support the church, while others get to play mysterious benefactor. It doesn't feel very community-minded. I was stunned by the direction this conversation was taking. These people were actually complaining about receiving generous donations that had transformed their church experience. They were suspicious of gifts that had been given with pure hearts and no expectations of control or recognition. I think, I said as diplomatically as possible, that the Bible teaches us to give without seeking recognition. Matthew 6:3 says not to let your left hand know what your right hand is doing when you give to charity. Pastor Donovan smiled condescendingly. Mrs. Calloway, that's a lovely sentiment. But we're talking about church governance here, not personal charity. When someone makes major financial contributions to the church, it affects everyone. Don't you think the congregation has a right to know who's making decisions about how their church money is spent? But anonymous donations aren't controlling how church money is spent, I protested. They're adding to the church's resources. The donor isn't making demands or trying to influence decisions. How do we know that? Jana asked pointedly. How do we know this mysterious donor isn't expecting special treatment or influence in return for their generosity? It just seems like a way to avoid accountability. I felt sick to my stomach. These women whose church experience had been immeasurably improved by my anonymous giving, were essentially accusing me of being manipulative and self-serving. They had no idea that I had specifically chosen anonymous giving to avoid exactly the kind of influence and special treatment they were worried about. I think, Pastor Donovan said, that it's time for our church to move toward a more transparent model of stewardship. Major donors should be known to the congregation, and major expenditures should be decided by committees rather than being funded by mysterious benefactors. The irony was breathtaking. The kitchen we were standing in, the beautiful sanctuary where he preached every week, the youth programs that had made his ministry so successful, all of it had been made possible by the mysterious benefactor he was now criticizing. What if? I asked carefully. The anonymous donor preferred to remain anonymous for personal reasons. What if they weren't trying to control anything, but simply wanted to give without recognition? Then they need to understand, Pastor Donovan said firmly, that their personal preferences can't take priority over the health and transparency of the church community. If someone wants to make major contributions to this church, they need to be willing to do it openly and work within our established decision-making processes. My head was spinning. After 18 years of generous, selfless giving that had asked for nothing in return except the joy of seeing my church family thrive, I was being told that my approach was harmful to the community. The very anonymity that I had thought was virtuous was being painted as suspicious and manipulative. But surely, I said, you're grateful for all the improvements these donations have made possible. Of course we're grateful, Beverly said. But gratitude doesn't mean we have to accept whatever terms some mysterious donor wants to impose on us. What terms? I asked, genuinely confused. Anonymous donations don't impose any terms. Don't they? Linda said. The very fact that we don't know who's making these donations means we can't have honest conversations about them. We can't express concerns, we can't ask questions, we can't make sure the gifts align with our church's values and priorities. I was beginning to realize that this conversation was revealing something ugly about the church community I had devoted my life to serving. These women weren't grateful for the anonymous donations, they were resentful of them. They seemed to view generosity as somehow unfair to those who had less to give. "I think what we're all trying to say," Jonna said, speaking as if she were being patient with a child, "is that this anonymous donor situation has created an unhealthy dynamic in our church. Some people get to be heroes by writing big checks, while the rest of us do the actual work of building and maintaining the community. But why can't both types of contribution be valued?" I ask. Why does giving money mean someone isn't also contributing time and effort? Pastor Donovan gave me another one of those condescending smiles. "Mrs. Calloway, you're very sweet, but you might not understand the complexities of church administration. When someone makes large anonymous donations, it can create problems for leadership. We can't plan properly, we can't ensure that gifts align with our strategic priorities, and we can't maintain accountability to the congregation." Sweet. He had called me sweet in the most patronizing tone imaginable. As if I were a well-meaning but naive old lady who couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated challenges of running a modern church. This from a man whose entire ministry had been built on the foundation of my anonymous support. "I'm sure the anonymous donor would be happy to discuss priorities with church leadership," I said carefully. "Perhaps if you reached out through the same channels used to send donations, you could establish better communication." "That's exactly the problem," Pastor Donovan said. "We shouldn't have to communicate through mysterious channels. If someone wants to be a major partner in this church's mission, they should be willing to be an open partner. And if they're not willing," I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer. Pastor Donovan's expression hardened. "Then perhaps they should consider whether their giving is really about serving God or about serving their own ego." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. According to the pastor of Hillcrest Community Church, my 18 years of sacrificial giving, given specifically to avoid recognition or control, was actually an ego trip. My careful anonymity, designed to prevent exactly the kind of influence and special treatment these women were worried about, was being characterized as selfish and manipulative. I felt tears beginning to form in my eyes, but I was determined not to let them see how deeply their words had hurt me. "I think," I said quietly, "that only God can judge the motives behind someone's giving." "True," Pastor Donovan said, "but church leadership has a responsibility to ensure that all aspects of church life serve the community's best interests. That includes major financial contributions." The bell in the church tower began chiming, signaling that it was time for the morning service to begin. The women in the kitchen began putting finishing touches on their preparations, but I couldn't focus on the festive atmosphere anymore. The conversation had shaken me to my core. As we filed out of the kitchen toward the sanctuary, I tried to process what I had just experienced. The people I had been serving and supporting for nearly 5 decades had just spent 30 minutes essentially attacking me, though they had no idea they were doing it. They had characterized my generosity as problematic, my anonymity as suspicious, and my motives as selfish. But the worst part was yet to come. As Pastor Donovan had mentioned, he planned to address the issue of anonymous giving in his sermon. I settled into my usual spot in the third pew, surrounded by the beauty that my donations had helped create, and waited to hear how my pastor would publicly characterize the giving that had made his ministry possible. The service began normally enough. The congregation sang hymns accompanied by the organ I had helped purchase, their voices echoing beautifully in the acoustic. "I think what we're all trying to say," Jonna said, speaking as if she were being patient with a child, "is that this anonymous donor situation has created an unhealthy dynamic in our church. Some people get to be heroes by writing big checks, while the rest of us do the actual work of building and maintaining the community. But why can't both types of contribution be valued?" I ask. Why does giving money mean someone isn't also contributing time and effort? Pastor Donovan gave me another one of those condescending smiles. "Mrs. Calloway, you're very sweet, but you might not understand the complexities of church administration. When someone makes large anonymous donations, it can create problems for leadership. We can't plan properly, we can't ensure that gifts align with our strategic priorities, and we can't maintain accountability to the congregation. Sweet. He had called me sweet in the most patronizing tone imaginable. As if I were a well-meaning but naive old lady who couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated challenges of running a modern church. This from a man whose entire ministry had been built on the foundation of my anonymous support. I'm sure the anonymous donor would be happy to discuss priorities with church leadership, I said carefully. Perhaps if you reached out through the same channels used to send donations, you could establish better communication. That's exactly the problem, Pastor Donovan said. We shouldn't have to communicate through mysterious channels. If someone wants to be a major partner in this church's mission, they should be willing to be an open partner. And if they're not willing, I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer. Pastor Donovan's expression hardened. Then perhaps they should consider whether their giving is really about serving God or about serving their own ego. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. According to the pastor of Hillcrest Community Church, my 18 years of sacrificial giving, given specifically to avoid recognition or control, was actually an ego trip. My careful anonymity, designed to prevent exactly the kind of influence and special treatment these women were worried about, was being characterized as selfish and manipulative. I felt tears beginning to form in my eyes, but I was determined not to let them see how deeply their words had hurt me. I think, I said quietly, that only God can judge the motives behind someone's giving. True, Pastor Donovan said, but church leadership has a responsibility to ensure that all aspects of church life serve the community's best interests. That includes major financial contributions. The bell in the church tower began chiming, signaling that it was time for the morning service to begin. The women in the kitchen began putting finishing touches on their preparations, but I couldn't focus on the festive atmosphere anymore. The conversation had shaken me to my core. As we filed out of the kitchen toward the sanctuary, I tried to process what I had just experienced. The people I had been serving and supporting for nearly 5 decades had just spent 30 minutes essentially attacking me, though they had no idea they were doing it. They had characterized my generosity as problematic, my anonymity as suspicious, and my motives as selfish. But the worst part was yet to come. As Pastor Donovan had mentioned, he planned to address the issue of anonymous giving in his sermon. I settled into my usual spot in the third pew, surrounded by the beauty that my donations had helped create, and waited to hear how my pastor would publicly characterize the giving that had made his ministry possible. The service began normally enough. The congregation sang hymns accompanied by the organ I had helped purchase, their voices echoing beautifully in the acoustically perfect sanctuary my donations had helped design. The morning light streamed through the stained glass windows that bore no plaque or recognition of my contribution, but which gave me joy every time I saw them. But when Pastor Donovan stepped up to the pulpit to deliver his sermon, I could feel my stomach clenching with anxiety. His text was from 1 Corinthians 14:33. For God is not a God of confusion but of peace, my dear brothers and sisters, he began. Today I want to talk to you about transparency, accountability, and the importance of order in God's house. Here it comes, I thought. For some time now, our church has been the recipient of generous anonymous donations that have funded many of our facility improvements and program expansions. While we are certainly grateful for these gifts, I believe it's time for us to have an honest conversation about whether this arrangement serves the best interests of our church community. I gripped the edge of the pew, my knuckles turning white. The Bible calls us to be good stewards of the resources God provides, and good stewardship requires transparency and accountability. When major financial decisions are made by unknown benefactors, it undermines the democratic processes that keep our church healthy and united. Democratic processes. I had never made any financial decisions for the church. I had simply provided resources and allowed the church leadership to decide how to use them. Every project I had funded had been planned and executed by church committees. Furthermore, Pastor Donovan continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction, anonymous giving can create an unhealthy dynamic within the congregation. It can foster resentment among members who contribute according to their means but see their efforts overshadowed by mysterious large donations. It can also enable donors to avoid the accountability and community engagement that should accompany major financial support. My face was burning with shame and anger. Pastor Donovan shrugged. That's certainly their choice, but if maintaining their anonymity is more important to them than supporting the church's mission, then perhaps their motives weren't as pure as we thought. The accusation hit me like a slap. According to Pastor Donovan, if I chose not to reveal my identity, it would prove that my giving had been selfishly motivated. He had created a trap where any response other than compliance would be characterized as evidence of impure motives. What if, I asked, the donor had good reasons for preferring anonymity? What if they were following biblical principles about not letting the left hand know what the right hand is doing? Pastor Donovan gave me that condescending smile again. Mrs. Calloway, biblical principles need to be balanced with practical church administration. We can't run a modern church based solely on ancient proverbs. He had just dismissed Jesus' teachings about giving as outdated advice unsuitable for modern church life. I see, I said. And what about all the improvements that have been made possible by anonymous donations, the kitchen, the sanctuary expansion, the youth programs? We're certainly grateful for those contributions, he said, but moving forward, we need to ensure that major expenditures are made through proper channels and with full transparency. And if that means fewer resources for improvements and programs, then we'll learn to do more with less. Sometimes sacrifice builds character. I almost laughed out loud at the irony. Pastor Donovan was lecturing me about sacrifice while sitting in an office in a building that my sacrifices had helped create, leading a congregation whose growth and success had been enabled by my financial support. Is there anything else? I asked, standing to leave. Actually, yes, Pastor Donovan said. As you know, the Harvest Festival celebration this afternoon will include the traditional blessing of volunteer appreciation. This year, we're making some changes to that ceremony. My heart sank. For 47 years, the volunteer appreciation blessing had been one of the highlights of my year. It was a time when the pastor publicly acknowledged the service of church members. And while I had never sought recognition, it had always been meaningful to be included among the faithful servants of the church. What kind of changes? I asked. We're focusing the recognition on members who represent the kind of transparent, accountable service we want to encourage. People who work openly with committees, who contribute in ways that build community rather than creating dependencies. The message was clear. I would not be included in this year's volunteer appreciation, despite 47 years of faithful service. Despite my role in organizing and funding countless church activities, I was being excluded from recognition because my financial contributions had been anonymous. I understand, I said, though I felt like I might be sick. I hope you do understand, Miss. Pastor Donovan shrugged. That's certainly their choice, but if maintaining their anonymity is more important to them than supporting the church's mission, then perhaps their motives weren't as pure as we thought. The accusation hit me like a slap. According to Pastor Donovan, if I chose not to reveal my identity, it would prove that my giving had been selfishly motivated. He had created a trap where any response other than compliance would be characterized as evidence of impure motives. What if, I asked, the donor had good reasons for preferring anonymity? What if they were following biblical principles about not letting the left hand know what the right hand is doing? Pastor Donovan gave me that condescending smile again. Mrs. Calloway, biblical principles need to be balanced with practical church administration. We can't run a modern church based solely on ancient proverbs. He had just dismissed Jesus' teachings about giving as outdated advice unsuitable for modern church life. I see, I said. And what about all the improvements that have been made possible by anonymous donations, the kitchen, the sanctuary expansion, the youth programs? We're certainly grateful for those contributions, he said, but moving forward, we need to ensure that major expenditures are made through proper channels and with full transparency. And if that means fewer resources for improvements and programs, then we'll learn to do more with less. Sometimes sacrifice builds character. I almost laughed out loud at the irony. Pastor Donovan was lecturing me about sacrifice while sitting in an office in a building that my sacrifices had helped create, leading a congregation whose growth and success had been enabled by my financial support. "Is there anything else?" I asked, standing to leave. "Actually, yes," Pastor Donovan said. "As you know, the Harvest Festival celebration this afternoon will include the traditional blessing of volunteer appreciation. This year, we're making some changes to that ceremony." My heart sank. For 47 years, the volunteer appreciation blessing had been one of the highlights of my year. It was a time when the pastor publicly acknowledged the service of church members. And while I had never sought recognition, it had always been meaningful to be included among the faithful servants of the church. "What kind of changes?" I asked. "We're focusing the recognition on members who represent the kind of transparent, accountable service we want to encourage, people who work openly with committees, who contribute in ways that build community rather than creating dependencies." The message was clear. I would not be included in this year's volunteer appreciation, despite 47 years of faithful service. Despite my role in organizing and funding countless church activities, I was being excluded from recognition because my financial contributions had been anonymous. "I understand," I said, though I felt like I might be sick. "I hope you do understand, Mrs. Calloway. This isn't personal. It's about establishing healthy patterns for the future of our church." I nodded and walked toward the door, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. "Oh, and Mrs. Calloway," Pastor Donovan called after me. I turned back. "I hope you'll consider what I've said about transparency and accountability. If you have any influence with our anonymous donor, perhaps you could encourage them to reconsider their approach." He still had no idea that he was speaking directly to the anonymous donor he was rejecting. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. I walked out of his office and through the beautiful sanctuary that had been transformed by my generosity, past the fellowship hall where the congregation was gathering for the feast prepared in the kitchen I had funded, and out into the crisp October afternoon. For the first time in 47 years, I would not be attending the Harvest Festival celebration at Hillcrest Community Church. For the first time in my adult life, I was questioning everything I had believed about Christian community, gratitude, and service. And for the first time since Cornelius died, I was beginning to think about what I might do with my remaining years and resources if they weren't going to be devoted to people who had just made it clear or they didn't want my anonymous support. The betrayal was complete, but the story was just beginning. The week following the Harvest Festival was the longest of my life. For 47 years, my routine had been as reliable as sunrise. Every morning I would wake up thinking about what needed to be done for the church. Every afternoon I would work on some project or preparation, and every evening I would plan the next day's service to my beloved congregation. But that Sunday had shattered everything. For the first time in nearly 5 decades, I found myself with no church responsibilities, no volunteer commitments, and no sense of purpose. Pastor Donovan had made it crystal clear that my type of service was no longer welcome at Hillcrest Community Church. I spent Monday wandering around my house on Elm Street like a ghost haunting her own life. Every room held reminders of my church work, the dining room table where I had addressed thousands of volunteers, or coordination letters, the kitchen where I had baked countless desserts for fellowship events, the spare bedroom filled with decorations and supplies for church programs that I was apparently no longer welcome to organize. Tuesday brought the first phone call. It was from Jonna Morrison, the Women's Fellowship president who had been so dismissive of anonymous donations during our kitchen conversation. "Beatrice," she said, her tone brisk and businesslike. "I'm calling about the Christmas pageant planning committee. We need to discuss some changes for this year's program." My heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. Perhaps they had reconsidered. Perhaps Pastor Donovan had realized how harsh his rejection had been. Perhaps there was still a place for me in the church community I had served so faithfully. "Of course," I said. "When would you like to meet? I've already started working on this year's script. And I have some wonderful ideas for costumes that would incorporate the new lighting system in the sanctuary." setup and cleanup crews. After 3 decades as the creative director and lead organizer of the Christmas pageant, I was being offered the opportunity to sweep floors and stack chairs. "I'll think about it," I said. "Great, I'll put you down as a maybe for cleanup crew." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at my hands, which had sewn hundreds of angel wings and shepherd robes over the years. Those same hands were now apparently only suitable for janitorial work. Wednesday brought another call, this time from Beverly Patterson about the annual Christmas decorating committee. "Beatrice, dear," she began, using the patronizing tone that I was beginning to recognize as the new normal in my interactions with church members. "I wanted to let you know about some changes we're making to the church decorating for this Christmas season." Here we go again, I thought. The board has decided that we need to be more mindful of expenses this year, Beverly continued. "Some of the decorating in previous years has been quite elaborate, and we think it's important to model financial responsibility for the congregation." Elaborate. My Christmas decorations, which had transformed the sanctuary into a breathtaking celebration of Christ's birth, were being characterized as fiscally irresponsible. Never mind that I had personally paid for most of the decorations over the years. Never mind that my elaborate displays had drawn visitors who often ended up joining the congregation. "I see," I said. "What kind of changes are you planning?" "We're going to focus on simpler, more budget-conscious decorating this year. Natural materials, homemade ornaments, that sort of thing. Very authentic and meaningful." "That sounds lovely," I said. "I'd be happy to help with whatever approach you decide to take. I have quite a bit of experience with different decorating styles." "Well," Beverly said, "actually, we've decided to have Linda Crawford coordinate the decorating committee as well. Since she's already heading up the Christmas pageant committee, it will be easier to ensure that everything coordinates properly." Linda Crawford again. The woman who had been with the church for 3 years was taking over responsibilities I had handled for decades. "I see," I said. "And will there be opportunities for other volunteers to participate?" "Oh, absolutely. We'll need lots of people to help make paper snowflakes and string popcorn garlands. Very family-friendly activities that everyone can participate in. Paper snowflakes and popcorn garlands." After 47 years of creating stunning floral arrangements and sophisticated decorative displays, I was being invited to make paper snowflakes. "Beverly," I said, "you know that I've been coordinating Christmas decorations for the church since the 1980s. Don't you think that experience might be useful to the new committee?" "Oh, Beatrice," Beverly said with a little laugh, "we all appreciate everything you've done over the years, but sometimes it's good to let other people have a chance to contribute their own ideas. You've certainly earned a rest from all those responsibilities." A rest? At 73, after spending my entire adult life in service to this church, I was being told that I needed to rest while younger members took over the work I had been doing successfully for decades. "I don't feel like I need a rest," I said. "I feel like I have a lot more to contribute." "I'm sure you do, dear. And we hope you'll contribute by supporting the new leadership and maybe helping with some of the simpler tasks that don't require as much physical energy." Simpler tasks that don't require as much physical energy. Beverly was essentially telling me that at 73, I was too old and frail to organize church decorations, despite the fact that I had more energy and enthusiasm than most people half my age. Thursday brought the most devastating call of all. It was from Pastor Donovan himself. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I wanted to speak with you about the upcoming Thanksgiving service and the Advent season." "Planning?" "Yes, Pastor," I said, still hoping against hope that someone in church leadership would recognize how valuable my contributions had been and ask me to resume my normal responsibilities. "As you know, we're implementing new approaches to holiday programming this year, with more committee-based planning and broader community involvement." "Yes, I've heard about the changes to the Christmas pageant and decorating committees." "Good. I'm calling because I wanted to discuss your role in the upcoming holiday services. As we move toward a more collaborative approach, we need to make sure that everyone understands their place in the new structure." "My place in the new structure?" The phrasing made it sound like I was a problem to be managed rather than a valued member to be included. "I'm always happy to serve wherever I'm needed," I said. "I appreciate that attitude," Pastor Donovan said. "Here's the situation. In previous years, you've taken on quite a lot of responsibility for holiday preparations, planning, organizing, decision-making. You've basically been running a one-woman show. My decades of dedicated service were being characterized as egotistical performance rather than faithful stewardship. I've always tried to serve wherever there was a need," I said. "I'm sure your intentions have been good," Pastor Donovan said. "But the result has been that other members haven't had opportunities to develop their own leadership skills or contribute their own ideas. Inadvertently, your enthusiasm has prevented the kind of community building that we're trying to encourage." My enthusiasm was preventing community building, according to Pastor Donovan. My willingness to organize and coordinate church activities was actually harmful to the congregation because it didn't give other people chances to volunteer for responsibilities they had shown no interest in taking on. "Pastor," I said, "I've always welcomed other volunteers. Every committee I've chaired has been open to new members, and I've always been happy to share responsibilities with anyone who wanted to help." Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan said, his tone becoming firmer. "I think we need to be honest about what's been happening here. Over the years, you've made yourself indispensable to so many church functions that other members have felt shut out. Whether that was your intention or not, the effect has been to create an unhealthy dependency on your involvement. Indispensable. Unhealthy dependency. My 4 decades of faithful service were being reframed as a psychological problem that had damaged the church community. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said. "I'm asking you to step back," Pastor Donovan said bluntly. "For the good of the church community, I think it would be best if you took a sabbatical from leadership responsibilities. Give other members a chance to step up. Let the community develop its own independence." A sabbatical from leadership responsibilities. After 47 years of faithful service, I was being asked to step away from everything I had devoted my life to doing. "For how long?" I asked. "Let's start with the rest of this year and see how things go," Pastor Donovan said. "The holiday season will be a good test of whether the congregation can function effectively with a more distributed leadership model. The rest of the year." He was asking me to step away from Thanksgiving preparations, Advent services, Christmas pageant, Christmas decorating, New Year's celebrations, everything that had given my life meaning and purpose for nearly 5 decades. "And what role would I have during this sabbatical?" I asked. "Well, you're always welcome to attend services and participate as a regular congregation member," Pastor Donovan said. "And I'm sure there will be opportunities for you to help with simple volunteer tasks that don't involve leadership or decision-making. Simple volunteer tasks, regular congregation member." After 47 years of devoted leadership, I was being demoted to the status of an ordinary attendee who might occasionally be allowed to help with menial labor. "Pastor," I said, "may I ask what prompted this decision? Has someone complained about my leadership? Have I done something wrong?" Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan said, "This isn't about punishment or complaints. This is about creating a healthier dynamic for the entire congregation. Sometimes the most loving thing a leader can do is step aside and let others grow into their own potential. The most loving thing I could do was disappear." According to Pastor Donovan, my 47 years of faithful service would be most valuable if I simply stopped doing them. "I see," I said, "and if I don't agree to this sabbatical." There was a long pause before Pastor Donovan answered. "Mrs. Calloway, I hope it won't come to that. I hope you'll see the wisdom in this approach and support it voluntarily. But if necessary, the church board is prepared to make more formal decisions about leadership responsibilities." The threat was clear. If I didn't voluntarily step aside, they would force me out through official church governance procedures. "I understand," I said. "I hope you do," Pastor Donovan said. "And I hope you'll use this time to reflect on what it means to serve with humility and to support the growth of others in the community. Serve with humility." After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen repeating those words. Apparently, for decades of anonymous giving, selfless organizing, and tireless volunteer work had not been humble enough for Pastor Donovan. Apparently. True humility required disappearing entirely. Friday brought the final insult, though. It came not through a phone call but through a chance encounter at Morrison's grocery store downtown. I was in the produce section, mechanically selecting vegetables for meals I wasn't sure I wanted to cook, when I heard familiar voices from the next aisle over. Jonna Morrison and Linda Crawford were discussing their plans for taking over the Christmas programs. "I can't believe how much work Beatrice has been doing all these years," Linda was saying. "No wonder other people felt like they couldn't contribute. She was basically running the entire holiday season by herself." "It's going to be so much better this way," Jonna replied. "More democratic, more inclusive. People will actually feel like they can participate instead of just being assigned tasks by Queen Beatrice." Queen Beatrice. My decades of service were being mocked with royal titles, as if I had been ruling the church like some kind of tyrant instead of working tirelessly to serve the congregation. "The funny thing is," Linda continued, she seemed genuinely surprised when Pastor Donovan told her to step back, like she really thought we all wanted her to keep controlling everything forever. Controlling everything. I had never controlled anything. I had simply taken responsibility for tasks that no one else wanted to do, organized events that no one else was willing to coordinate, and given my time and money to make the church experience better for everyone. "Well," Jonna said. "At her age, maybe it's for the best. 73 is pretty old to be running around trying to manage everything. She probably needs to slow down whether she wants to or not. At my age." These women, who were in their 50s and had never demonstrated a fraction of my energy or dedication, were dismissing me as too old to contribute to the church I had served faithfully since before they were born. "I just hope she doesn't cause problems," Linda said. "You know how some older people get when they're forced to give up control. They can become really bitter and difficult. Bitter and difficult." They were already characterizing any objection I might have to their treatment as evidence of age-related personality problems rather than legitimate concerns about being pushed out of my life's work. Pastor Donovan said he was very clear with her about the expectations. Jonna said, "If she tries to interfere with the new committees, the board will have to take more direct action." More direct action. They were already planning how to deal with me if I didn't quietly accept my banishment from church leadership. "It's really sad," Linda said. "She's devoted so much of her life to the church. But sometimes people just can't recognize when it's time to let go and let others take over." Sad. Devoted. Can't recognize when it's time to let go, in the span of 2 sentences. Linda had acknowledged my lifetime of devotion and then characterized my reluctance to abandon it as a personal failing. I stood frozen behind the Apple display, listening to these women casually dissect my life and dismiss my contributions as obstacles to their own ambitions. These were people I had served, programs I had funded, events I had organized for their benefit, and they were talking about me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. But the conversation wasn't over. "You know what I don't understand," Jonna said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Where does she get the money for all those elaborate decorations and expensive materials she's been using all these years? Harold and I barely make ends meet with our church contributions, but Beatrice always seems to have unlimited funds for her projects." My blood ran cold. They were starting to speculate about my finances, getting dangerously close to questions that could expose my anonymous giving. "I've wondered about that too," Linda said. "I mean, she's just a widow living alone. How much money could she possibly have? Sometimes I wonder if she's been using church funds inappropriately for her own projects." Using church funds inappropriately. They were now suggesting that I might be embezzling from the church to fund my volunteer work. The irony was breathtaking. They were accusing me of stealing money from the very church to which I had anonymously donated over $1 million. "That's a serious accusation," Jonna said, but her tone suggested she was intrigued rather than shocked by the possibility. "I'm not accusing her of anything," Linda said quickly. I'm just saying it's odd that someone in her financial situation seems to have so much money to spend on church projects. Maybe the board should look into where that money is coming from. Maybe the board should look into it. They were already planning to investigate my finances, suspecting me of the exact opposite of what I had actually been doing. It would explain why she's so possessive of her leadership roles, Jonna said, thoughtfully. If she's been using church money for her own projects, she'd want to stay in control to cover her tracks. Cover my tracks. My decades of service were now being reinterpreted as a criminal conspiracy to embezzle church funds for personal gain. We should probably mention this to Pastor Donovan, Linda said. He should know if there are financial irregularities in the programs Beatrice has been managing. They were going to accuse me of embezzlement to Pastor Donovan. The pastor who had already rejected my anonymous giving was about to be told that I might be stealing money from the church I had secretly supported for 18 years. I couldn't listen to any more. I abandoned my shopping cart and fled the store, my heart pounding and my hands shaking with rage and devastation. By the time I reached my car, I was crying so hard I could barely see to drive. In the span of 1 week, I had gone from being the most devoted member of Hillcrest Community Church to being a suspected embezzler who was too old and controlling to be trusted with any responsibilities. The people I had served faithfully for 47 years had turned on me with a viciousness that took my breath away. They had dismissed my contributions, minimized my dedication. And now they were planning to accuse me of crimes I had never committed while benefiting from generosity they didn't even know about. As I sat in my driveway, trying to compose myself enough to go into my house, I realized that something fundamental had shifted inside me. The hurt and confusion of the past week were crystallizing into something harder and more focused. For 47 years, I had given everything I had to Hillcrest Community Church. My time, my energy, my creativity, my leadership, and over $1 million of my money. I had asked for nothing in return except the joy of serving my church family. And in response, they had decided I was a controlling, bitter, possibly criminal old woman who needed to be removed from any position of influence or responsibility. They wanted me gone, fine. They thought I was too old and irrelevant to contribute to their church, perfect. They suspected me of financial impropriety while sitting in buildings I had helped fund and benefiting from programs I had helped create. Excellent, because what they didn't know, what none of them had any idea about, was that their anonymous benefactor, the mysterious donor they had been discussing and dismissing and suspecting, was sitting in her car in the driveway of 1247 Elm Street, and she was absolutely done with their ingratitude. They wanted transparency. They were about to get more transparency than they could handle. They wanted to know where the anonymous donations had been coming from. They were about to find out. They wanted to take their church in a new direction without the influence of mysterious benefactors. They were about to discover exactly what that new direction would cost them. For the first time in a week, I was smiling. Because Beatrice Calloway, the sweet old lady who had devoted her life to serving Hillcrest Community Church, was about to disappear forever. And in her place, they were going to meet someone they had never seen before, a woman with over $1 million in financial leverage, 18 years of documented generosity, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The game was about to change, and they had no idea what was coming. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I had spent a sleepless night replaying the grocery store conversation, each word cutting deeper than the last. By dawn, I had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I was going to confront this situation head-on. For 47 years, I had been the peacemaker, the accommodating servant who absorbed criticism and worked around conflicts to keep the church community harmonious. But something had fundamentally changed in me during that devastating week. The sweet, deferential Beatrice Calloway, who had spent her life putting everyone else's needs first, was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized but was beginning to respect. I spent the morning preparing for what I knew would be my final attempt to resolve this situation through normal channels. I gathered every piece of documentation I had related to my church service, photographs of events I had organized, Receipts for materials I had purchased, thank you cards from grateful families, even my personal calendars showing the countless hours I had devoted to church activities over the decades. But more importantly, I prepared a detailed financial summary of my anonymous donations, every check, every transfer, every contribution I had made over the past 18 years, complete with dates, amounts, and the specific projects they had funded. If Pastor Donovan and his supporters wanted transparency, I was prepared to give them more transparency than they had ever imagined. At 2 o'clock, I drove to the church for what I planned as a private meeting with Pastor Donovan. I had called his office that morning and left a message saying I needed to discuss my sabbatical and some financial matters related to church projects. His secretary, Mrs. Henderson, no relation to the former pastor, had called back to confirm a meeting at 2:30. I arrived early and sat in my car in the church parking lot, looking at the building that had been the center of my life for nearly 5 decades. The beautiful stonework that had been restored with my anonymous donation in 2010, the elegant signage that had been updated with my funding in 2016. The gorgeous landscaping that I had personally hired and paid for to beautify God's house. Every visual reminder of my generosity only intensified my anger at how I was being treated. These people had no idea they were sitting in judgment of the very person who had made their comfortable church experience possible. At 2:25, I walked through the front doors of Hillcrest Community Church carrying a briefcase full of documentation that would change everything. Mrs. Henderson greeted me with the same cool politeness that had become standard in my interactions with church staff. Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan is expecting you. He's in his office with a few board members discussing year-end planning. Board members. I hadn't expected an audience, but perhaps it was better this way. If I was going to reveal the truth about my anonymous giving, it might be more efficient to tell multiple church leaders at once. Mrs. Henderson led me down the familiar hallway to Pastor Donovan's office. Through the partially open door, I could hear voices engaged in animated discussion. She knocked gently and announced my arrival. "Send her in," Pastor Donovan's voice called. I stepped into the office to find not just Pastor Donovan, but 3 other people seated around his conference table: Jonna Morrison, the Women's Fellowship President, Harold Morrison, Johnette's husband and chairman of the church board, and Douglas Crawford, Linda's husband and the church treasurer. The sight of these specific individuals gathered together sent a chill through me. These were exactly the people who had been most critical of my leadership and most suspicious of my finances. This wasn't going to be a pastoral conversation about my sabbatical. This was going to be an interrogation. "Mrs. Calloway," Pastor Donovan said, rising from his chair with a grave expression, "thank you for coming in. Please, have a seat." I settled into the chair across from the assembled group, placing my briefcase on the floor beside me. The atmosphere in the room was tense and formal, nothing like the warm pastoral conversations I had enjoyed with previous church leadership over the years. "Mrs. Calloway," Harold Morrison began, consulting a yellow legal pad covered with handwritten notes. "We asked you here today because some concerns have been raised about financial irregularities in several church programs that you've been managing." Financial irregularities. They were starting exactly where I had expected, with accusations based on the suspicions I had overheard at the grocery store. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked. Keeping my voice steady, Douglas Crawford opened a manila folder and spread several documents on the table. "We've been reviewing the budgets and expenses for various programs over the past few years, and we've noticed some discrepancies that we'd like you to explain. For example," Jonna Morrison added, "the Christmas pageant expenses for the past 5 years show costume and prop purchases totaling over $8,000, but the pageant committee budget for those years was only allocated $3,000 total." I almost laughed. They were questioning how I had managed to create beautiful pageants on inadequate budgets, not realizing that I had personally supplemented their stingy allocations with my own money. "Where did the additional funding come from?" Harold Morrison asked pointedly. "I provided it myself," I said simply. The budget allocations were insufficient for the kind of pageant the congregation expected, so I made up the difference with my own funds. The 4 board members exchanged glances that clearly communicated their skepticism. Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan said, "That's a very generous claim, but we need to see documentation of these personal contributions for accountability purposes. All church expenditures need to be properly tracked and recorded. I have receipts for everything," I said, reaching for my briefcase. "I've been keeping detailed records of all my personal contributions to church programs for decades." "That's not quite what we're asking about," Douglas Crawford interjected. "We're asking about discrepancies between allocated budgets and actual expenses. If money was being spent beyond the approved budgets, we need to understand the authorization process that was followed." Authorization process. They weren't questioning the source of the additional funding, they were questioning my authority to spend it. In their minds, I should have requested permission before using my own money to improve their church programs. I didn't realize I needed authorization to spend my own money on church activities, I said. Mrs. Calloway, Harold Morrison said, his tone becoming stern, "Any expenditures made in connection with official church programs need to go through proper channels, regardless of the funding source. We can't have individuals making financial decisions about church activities without board oversight." I stared at him in disbelief. They were criticizing me for spending my own money to improve their church programs because I hadn't asked their permission first. "Let me understand this correctly," I said. "You're concerned because I used my personal funds to supplement inadequate church budgets, and I did so without requesting permission from the board." "That's exactly right," Jonna Morrison said. "Church governance requires transparency and accountability in all financial matters. Personal generosity doesn't exempt someone from following proper procedures." "And what would those proper procedures have been?" I asked. "You should have come to the board, explained that the allocated budget was insufficient, and requested additional funding through normal channels," Pastor Donovan explained. "If the board had determined that additional funding was warranted, we would have either increased the allocation or authorized a special fundraising effort." I sat in stunned silence, processing what they were telling me. According to these people, the proper response to inadequate church budgets was not to quietly supplement them with my own money, but to burden the congregation with additional fundraising efforts or to accept lower quality programs. But the end result would have been the same, I said. Either the congregation would have had to contribute more money, or the programs would have been diminished. By using my own funds, I achieved better results without burdening anyone else. "But you achieved those results by circumventing established governance procedures," Douglas Crawford said. "That sets a dangerous precedent for financial management." Dangerous precedent. My generosity was being characterized as a threat to proper church administration. Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan said, "I think you need to understand the broader implications of what you've been doing. When individuals make unauthorized financial decisions about church programs, it undermines the authority of elected leadership and creates confusion about who's really in charge. Who's really in charge? Now we were getting to the heart of the matter. This wasn't about financial accountability or proper procedures. This was about power and control. These board members were threatened by the fact that my personal contributions had enabled programs and improvements that they couldn't have achieved through normal church funding. "I never intended to undermine anyone's authority," I said. "I simply wanted to help create the best possible programs for the congregation." Mrs. Calloway, Harold Morrison said, "Intentions are less important than results. The result of your unauthorized spending has been to create programs and standards that the church can't sustain through normal funding. That puts the board in an impossible position." I felt like I was listening to people speak a foreign language. They were complaining that I had made their church programs too good, that my generosity had created unsustainable expectations for quality and excellence. "So what are you asking me to do?" I said. "We're asking you to reimburse the church for any unauthorized expenditures you've made over the past 5 years. Douglas Crawford said, sliding a document across the table. We've calculated the total amount of spending that exceeded approved budgets, and we need that money returned to the church treasury." I looked at the document in shock. It was an itemized list of my personal contributions to church programs, calculated as if they were unauthorized church expenditures that needed to be repaid. The total came to $47,000. They wanted me to pay them $47,000 for the privilege of having improved their church programs with my own money. "You want me to reimburse the church for money that I contributed to church programs?" I asked, making sure I understood correctly. "We want you to reimburse the church for unauthorized expenditures that were made without proper board oversight," Jonna Morrison clarified. "The fact that you personally funded those expenditures doesn't change the fact that they violated established procedures." I stared at the 4 people seated across from me, people I had served faithfully for decades, people whose church experience had been immeasurably improved by my contributions, and realized that they were completely serious. They actually expected me to pay them $47,000 as punishment for having been too generous to their church, and if I refuse, I asked, then we'll have to consider more formal action. Pastor Donovan said, "The board has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure proper financial management. If necessary, we're prepared to involve outside authorities to investigate potential financial misconduct." Outside authorities. They were threatening to have me investigated by law enforcement for the crime of being too generous to their church. But the conversation was far from over. "There's another matter we need to discuss," Harold Morrison said, consulting his legal pad again. "We've received reports that you may have had access to information about the church's anonymous donor situation." My heart began racing. This was the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating. "What kind of reports?" I asked carefully. "Several congregation members have noticed that you seem unusually well informed about the timing and amounts of anonymous donations," Jonna Morrison said. "There have been suggestions that you might have inappropriate access to confidential financial information." Inappropriate access to confidential financial information. They were accusing me of somehow finding out about my own anonymous donations. "Can you give me a specific example of what you're referring to?" I asked. Douglas Crawford opened another folder. "Last month, when the board was discussing the anonymous donation that funded the kitchen renovation, you made several comments that suggested detailed knowledge of the donor's intentions and timeline. Some board members found it suspicious that a regular congregation member would have that level of insight. I had made comments about the kitchen renovation because I was the one who had funded it. But to them, my knowledge appeared to be evidence of some kind of financial impropriety." Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan said, "I need to ask you directly. Do you have any unauthorized access to church financial records or correspondence with our anonymous donor?" This was it. This was the moment where I could reveal the truth and change everything. I could open my briefcase, show them 18 years of documentation, and watch their accusations crumble into embarrassed apologies. But something held me back. The cruel dismissiveness of the past week, the systematic destruction of my life's work, the threats and accusations and condescending treatment. All of it had created something hard and cold inside me that wasn't ready to give them the satisfaction of an easy resolution. Instead, I decided to push the situation to its absolute breaking point. "No," I said calmly. "I don't have any unauthorized access to church financial records or correspondence with anonymous donors." It was technically true. My access to information about anonymous donations wasn't unauthorized, it was inherent, since I was the anonymous donor. "Then how do you explain your detailed knowledge of donation timing and amounts?" Harold Morrison pressed. "I'm a long-time member of this congregation," I said. "I pay attention to church announcements and board reports. I notice when improvements are made and when funding becomes available. I don't think that kind of awareness requires access to confidential information." Mrs. Calloway, Jonna Morrison said, "Some congregation members have suggested that your knowledge goes beyond what would be available through normal church communications." Some congregation members. I knew exactly which members they were referring to, the same people who had been speculating about my finances at the grocery store. Are you accusing me of something specific? I asked. The 4 board members exchanged another round of meaningful glances. Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan said finally, "We're not making accusations. We're asking for clarification about some concerns that have been raised by faithful congregation members." Faithful congregation members. The people who had been gossiping about me and spreading suspicions were being characterized as faithful, while I, who had actually been faithful beyond their wildest imagination, was being treated as a suspect. What specific clarification do you need? I asked. Douglas Crawford leaned forward. Mrs. Calloway, we need you to understand that financial irregularities in church programs are a serious matter. If there's been any inappropriate coordination between church leadership and outside donors, or any misuse of confidential financial information, we have a responsibility to investigate thoroughly any inappropriate coordination with outside donors. They were now suggesting that I might be colluding with the anonymous donor myself to manipulate church finances. And if your investigation doesn't find any evidence of inappropriate coordination or misuse of information, I asked, then we'll be satisfied that proper procedures were followed. Harold Morrison said, but until we can verify that, we need to take precautionary measures. What kind of precautionary measures? Pastor Donovan consulted a document on his desk. Effective immediately, you're being removed from all positions of financial responsibility within the church, no budget access, no purchasing authority, no involvement in any programs that handle church funds, removed from all positions of financial responsibility. After 47 years of faithful stewardship, I was being treated like a suspected embezzler. Additionally, Jonna Morrison said, we're implementing new oversight procedures for all church programs. Every expenditure over $50 will require pre-approval from the board, and all program coordinators will need to submit detailed financial reports monthly. New oversight procedures that would make it nearly impossible to supplement church budgets with personal funds, even if someone wanted to. And, Douglas Crawford added, we're establishing a new policy regarding contact with anonymous donors. Any information about anonymous donations will be considered confidential, and unauthorized sharing of such information will be grounds for removal from church membership. They were making it a punishable offense to know too much about anonymous donations, a policy that would technically make my own knowledge of my giving a violation of church rules. Is there anything else? I asked. Pastor Donovan nodded grimly. Mrs. Calloway, given the concerns that have been raised about your financial management and your possible access to confidential information, the board has decided that it would be best if you took an extended leave of absence from all church activities while we conduct a thorough review of these matters. An extended leave of absence from all church activities. I was being banned from my own church while they investigated me for crimes I hadn't committed. How extended? I asked. Until the investigation is complete and all financial irregularities have been resolved, Harold Morrison said. We estimate it will take at least 3 to 6 months to review all the relevant records and interview all the necessary parties. 3 to 6 months. They were banishing me from the church I had served for 47 years, funded with over $1 million of my own money, and devoted my. We want you to reimburse the church for unauthorized expenditures that were made without proper board oversight, Jonna Morrison clarified. The fact that you personally funded those expenditures doesn't change the fact that they violated established procedures. I stared at the 4 people seated across from me, people I had served faithfully for decades, people whose church experience had been immeasurably improved by my contributions, and realized that they were completely serious. They actually expected me to pay them $47,000 as punishment for having been too generous to their church, and if I refuse, I asked, then we'll have to consider more formal action. Pastor Donovan said, the board has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure proper financial management. If necessary, we're prepared to involve outside authorities to investigate potential financial misconduct. Outside authorities. They were threatening to have me investigated by law enforcement for the crime of being too generous to their church. But the conversation was far from over. "There's another matter we need to discuss," Harold Morrison said, consulting his legal pad again. "We've received reports that you may have had access to information about the church's anonymous donor situation." My heart began racing. This was the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating. "What kind of reports?" I asked. "Carefully. Several congregation members have noticed that you seem unusually well informed about the timing and amounts of anonymous donations," John Morrison said. "There have been suggestions that you might have inappropriate access to confidential financial information." Inappropriate access to confidential financial information. They were accusing me of somehow finding out about my own anonymous donations. "Can you give me a specific example of what you're referring to?" I asked. Douglas Crawford opened another folder. "Last month, when the board was discussing the anonymous donation that funded, when you decided to reject anonymous donations and demand transparency from all major contributors, did you consider the possibility that your anonymous donor might decide to take their generosity else?" "You were," Pastor Donovan's expression remained confident. "Mrs. Calloway, if someone's giving is contingent on being able to avoid accountability and transparency, then perhaps their motives weren't as pure as we thought. The church will be better off with donors who are willing to work openly within our governance structure." Perfect. He had just told me exactly what I needed to hear. "I see," I said. "And if this anonymous donor decided to redirect their future giving to other organizations, say, other churches that might be more appreciative of generous support, would that concern you?" "Mrs. Calloway," Pastor Donovan said with a condescending smile, "Hillcrest Community Church has weathered many changes over the years. We'll continue to thrive based on the faithful giving of our committed congregation members, not on the whims of mysterious benefactors who want to operate outside our normal procedures." Whims of mysterious benefactors. My 18 years of faithful support were being characterized as whimsical and outside normal procedures. "One more question," I said. "What if this anonymous donor had been contributing substantially more than you realized? What if losing their support would seriously impact the church's ability to maintain current programs and facilities?" Harold Morrison spoke up. "Mrs. Calloway, we appreciate your concern for the church's financial stability, but we've done careful projections. Even if we lose the anonymous donations entirely, we can maintain our essential programs through regular congregational giving and modest adjustments to our budget." Modest adjustments to their budget. They had no idea what was coming. "I understand," I said. "Thank you for clarifying the board's position." I turned to leave, but Pastor Donovan stopped me. "Mrs. Calloway, I hope you'll use this time away from church activities to reflect on what it means to serve with humility and transparency. When you're ready to rejoin the congregation under the new guidelines, we'll be happy to welcome you back. Serve with humility and transparency." After he finished speaking, I turned back to face the assembled board members one final time. "Pastor Donovan," I said, "I want to make sure I understand the church's new position clearly. You no longer want anonymous donations, you require all major contributors to identify themselves and work within your governance structure. And you believe the church will be better off without mysterious benefactors who operate outside normal procedures." "That's correct. And you're confident that the congregation's regular giving will be sufficient to maintain current programs and facilities even without anonymous support?" "We are." "Excellent," I said, smiling for the first time since entering the office. "Then you'll be very pleased to learn that the anonymous donor you've been discussing has decided to honor your wishes completely." The 4 board members looked puzzled but not concerned. Beginning immediately, I continued, there will be no more anonymous donations to Hillcrest Community Church. The mysterious benefactor you find so problematic has decided to redirect their generosity to organizations that appreciate transparent, accountable, democratic support. "Well," Pastor Donovan said, "if that's their choice, then we'll respect it and move forward accordingly. I'm sure you, when you decided to reject anonymous donations and demand transparency from all major contributors, did you consider the possibility that your anonymous donor might decide to take their generosity else?" "You were." Pastor Donovan's expression remained confident. Mrs. Calloway, if someone's giving is contingent on being able to avoid accountability and transparency, then perhaps their motives weren't as pure as we thought. The church will be better off with donors who are willing to work openly within our governance structure. Perfect. He had just told me exactly what I needed to hear. I see, I said. And if this anonymous donor decided to redirect their future giving to other organizations, say, other churches that might be more appreciative of generous support, would that concern you? Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan said with a condescending smile, Hillcrest Community Church has weathered many changes over the years. We'll continue to thrive based on the faithful giving of our committed congregation members, not on the whims of mysterious benefactors who want to operate outside our normal procedures. Whims of mysterious benefactors. My 18 years of faithful support were being characterized as whimsical and outside normal procedures. One more question, I said. What if this anonymous donor had been contributing substantially more than you realized? What if losing their support would seriously impact the church's ability to maintain current programs and facilities? Harold Morrison spoke up. Mrs. Calloway, we appreciate your concern for the church's financial stability, but we've done careful projections. Even if we lose the anonymous donations entirely, we can maintain our essential programs through regular congregational giving and modest adjustments to our budget. Modest adjustments to their budget. They had no idea what was coming. I understand. I said, thank you for clarifying the board's position. I turned to leave, but Pastor Donovan stopped me. Mrs. Calloway, I hope you'll use this time away from church activities to reflect on what it means to serve with humility and transparency. When you're ready to rejoin the congregation under the new guidelines, we'll be happy to welcome you back. Serve with humility and transparency. After he finished speaking, I turned back to face the assembled board members one final time. Pastor Donovan, I said, I want to make sure I understand the church's new position clearly. You no longer want anonymous donations, you require all major contributors to identify themselves and work within your governance structure. And you believe the church will be better off without mysterious benefactors who operate outside normal procedures. That's correct. And you're confident that the congregation's regular giving will be sufficient to maintain current programs and facilities even without anonymous support. We are. Excellent, I said, smiling for the first time since entering the office. Then you'll be very pleased to learn that the anonymous donor you've been discussing has decided to honor your wishes completely. The 4 board members looked puzzled but not concerned. Beginning immediately, I continued, there will be no more anonymous donations to Hillcrest Community Church. The mysterious benefactor you find so problematic has decided to redirect their generosity to organizations that appreciate transparent, accountable, democratic support. Well, Pastor Donovan said, if that's their choice, then we'll respect it and move forward accordingly. I'm sure you will, I said. Good afternoon. I walked out of Pastor Donovan's office, through the beautiful hallway of the church I had helped build, past the stunning sanctuary I had helped fund, and out into the parking lot where my car was waiting. As I drove away from Hillcrest Community Church for what I already knew would be the last time as a member, I realized that the breaking point had finally been reached. They had pushed me as far as it was possible to push someone. And now they were about to discover exactly what they had lost. But I wasn't quite ready to reveal the full scope of their mistake. First, I wanted to watch them try to function without the anonymous support they had taken for granted for so long. And then, when they were struggling and desperate and beginning to understand the true cost of their ingratitude, I would show them exactly who their mysterious benefactor had been. The game was just beginning, and they had no idea that they had already lost. Sunday morning, November 5, 2023. Was the first Sunday in 47 years that I did not attend Hillcrest Community Church. Instead, I sat in my kitchen on Elm Street, drinking coffee and reading the local newspaper while my former congregation gathered in the sanctuary I had helped fund, completely unaware that their world was about to change forever. The past 3 weeks since my banishment had been illuminating. I had spent the time carefully planning my response, consulting with attorneys, and making some very interesting phone calls to other religious organizations in the area. Most importantly, I had been watching and waiting to see how long it would take Hillcrest Community Church to realize what they had lost. The answer, it turned out, was exactly 21 days. The first sign of trouble came on October 28, when the church's quarterly property insurance premium came due. For the past 8 years, I had been anonymously supplementing the church's insurance costs because the board had consistently under-budgeted for the true cost of insuring a building worth over $2 million. My anonymous quarterly contribution of $3,200 had made the difference between adequate coverage and the bare minimum policy the church budget could actually afford. When that payment didn't arrive from their mysterious benefactor, Douglas Crawford, the church treasurer, was forced to inform the board that they were facing an immediate $3,200 shortfall in their operating budget. The second sign came 3 days later, when the heating system in the fellowship hall began making ominous grinding noises. For the past 6 years, I had been anonymously funding quarterly maintenance visits from Riverside Heating and Cooling to ensure that the church's aging HVAC systems remained reliable. By November 4th, Harold Morrison had called an emergency board meeting to address what he was beginning to suspect was a catastrophic mistake, which brings me to November 5th. And the phone call that I had been expecting for 3 weeks, at 10:47 a.m., while Hillcrest Community Church was struggling through a worship service in a building that was already showing signs of neglect, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Pastor Donovan. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Good morning, Pastor Donovan," I said pleasantly. "Mrs. Calloway." His voice was strained and formal. "I hope you're well. I was calling to follow up on our conversation a few weeks ago, of course. How can I help you?" There was a long pause. "Mrs. Calloway, I need to ask you a direct question, and I hope you'll give me a direct answer." "Certainly. Do you know how to contact our anonymous donor?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Pastor Donovan, 3 weeks ago you told me that if someone's giving was contingent on avoiding accountability and transparency, then their motives weren't pure and the church would be better off without them. Has your position on that changed?" Another pause. "Mrs. Calloway, the board has been reviewing our financial situation, and we've discovered that our anonymous donor was providing much more support than we realized. We may have been hasty in our decision to require transparency from major contributors." Hasty. After 47 years of faithful service, my banishment and their rejection of anonymous giving was being characterized as hasty. "I see," I said. "And what specifically has changed your perspective?" "Well," Pastor Donovan said, clearly uncomfortable, "we've realized that several services and arrangements we thought were covered by our regular budget were actually being funded by anonymous donations. Without that support, we're facing some unexpected financial challenges." Unexpected financial challenges. They were facing the collapse of their entire support infrastructure. But Pastor Donovan was still trying to minimize the scope of their crisis. "How unfortunate," I said, "but I'm sure your confident projections about maintaining programs through regular congregational giving will see you through these challenges." "Mrs. Calloway," Pastor Donovan said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, "if you have any way to contact our former donor, we would be very grateful if you could encourage them to reconsider their decision to redirect their support elsewhere." Very grateful. 3 weeks ago, they had demanded that I pay them $47,000 and ban me from all church activities. Now they were begging for my help in contacting the donor they had rejected. "Pastor Donovan," I said, "even if I could contact this anonymous donor, why would they want to resume supporting a church that has publicly stated it doesn't want mysterious benefactors operating outside normal procedures?" "Mrs. Calloway, perhaps we were too rigid in our approach. We're certainly open to finding a middle ground that would allow anonymous giving to continue while ensuring appropriate oversight." A middle ground. After 18 years of perfectly appropriate anonymous giving, they were now willing to negotiate terms with the donor they had insulted and rejected. "What kind of middle ground did you have in mind?" I asked. "Well, perhaps anonymous donors could work directly with the pastor and treasurer to coordinate their giving with church needs without requiring public identification or board oversight of their personal motivations. In other words, they wanted to return to exactly the arrangement they had destroyed 3 weeks earlier, but they wanted to pretend it was a compromise rather than an admission of error. I see. I said, and what about the investigation into financial irregularities and unauthorized access to confidential information? Pastor Donovan cleared his throat. Mrs. Calloway, the board has completed its preliminary review of church financial records, and we haven't found any evidence of impropriety or unauthorized access to information. In fact, we've concluded that any concerns raised about your knowledge of church finances were unfounded. After 3 weeks of investigation, they had determined that I wasn't guilty of the crimes they had accused me of. But there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the damage they had done, no recognition of how wrongly they had treated me. How reassuring, I said. And my extended leave of absence from all church activities, Mrs. Calloway, the board would be happy to welcome you back to full participation in church activities immediately. We recognize that we may have overreacted to some unfounded concerns raised by congregation members. Overreacted to unfounded concerns. My banishment from the church I had served faithfully for 47 years was being characterized as a simple overreaction to gossip. Pastor Donovan, I said, I appreciate your call, but I think you should understand that my circumstances have changed significantly over the past 3 weeks. What do you mean? I mean that during my forced absence from Hillcrest Community Church, I've had time to explore other opportunities for service and giving. I've discovered that there are many religious organizations in our area that are far more appreciative of generous support and far less suspicious of their faithful volunteers. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Mrs. Calloway. Pastor Donovan said finally, "Are you saying that you've decided to leave Hillcrest Community Church?" "I'm saying that I've decided to redirect my time, energy, and resources to organizations that value what I have to offer." Mrs. Calloway, please, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. The board never intended to drive you away from the church. We were simply trying to ensure proper financial procedures were followed. Serious misunderstanding, according to Pastor Donovan, demanding that I pay $47.00 for improving their programs and banning me from church activities for 3 months had been a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate punishment. Pastor Donovan, I said, let me ask you something. When you told me that the church would be better off with donors who are willing to work openly within your governance structure, did you consider the possibility that your anonymous donor might be someone you were already treating very poorly? What do you mean? I mean that your anonymous donor might have been watching how you treated your most faithful volunteers and might have concluded that Hillcrest Community Church doesn't deserve their support. Pastor Donovan's voice became urgent. Mrs. Calloway, if you know something about our anonymous donor's identity or motivations, please share it with us. We need to understand what happened so we can make things right. They wanted to fix their relationship with their anonymous donor without acknowledging the damage they had done to their relationships with their congregation members. Pastor Donovan, I said, I think it's time for complete transparency, don't you? Yes, absolutely. Excellent. Then let me be completely transparent with you. I paused, savoring the moment I had been planning for 3 weeks. Pastor Donovan, I am your anonymous donor. The silence on the other end of the phone was so complete that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Pastor Donovan, are you still there? Mrs. Calloway, what did you say? I said that I am the anonymous donor you've been discussing, rejecting, and trying to contact. For the past 18 years, I have donated over $1.1 million to Hillcrest Community Church. Every major improvement, every program enhancement, every financial crisis that was mysteriously resolved, that was me. Another long silence. Mrs. Calloway, that's impossible, is it? Let me give you some details that might change your mind. The kitchen renovation was funded with a $75,000 donation I made in June 2023. The sanctuary expansion received $400,000 from me. Between 2011 and 2012, The youth center renovation was my $180,000 contribution in 2015. The new sound system, the landscaping, the parking lot lease, the insurance supplementation, the HVAC maintenance, all of it has been funded by me, anonymously, for 18 years. But how, Mrs. Calloway, you're a widow living alone. Where would you get that kind of money? My late husband Cornelius was very successful. Pastor Donovan, when he died 18 years ago, he left me with the means to be generous and the instruction to use our blessings to make God's world a little brighter. I chose to focus that generosity on Hillcrest Community Church because I thought it was my family. Mrs. Calloway, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? Why did you keep it secret? Because I wanted my giving to be pure, without expectation of recognition or influence. Because I believed in Matthew 6:2-3, not letting your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Because I thought anonymous giving was the most humble and selfless way to support my church family. Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan's voice was shaking now. If this is true, then we've made a terrible mistake. Yes, you have. You spent 3 weeks investigating me for suspicious knowledge of my own donations. You demanded that I pay you $47,000 for the privilege of having improved your programs with my own money. You banned me from church activities while you searched for evidence of crimes I never committed. And you did all of this while sitting in buildings I had helped fund, benefiting from programs I had supported, and taking for granted services I had been paying for. Mrs. Calloway, please. We didn't know. If we had known it was you, we never would have. You never would have what? Pastor Donovan treated your most generous supporter with suspicion and contempt, accused your most faithful volunteer of financial impropriety. Rejected the very giving that made your ministry possible. Mrs. Calloway, please let me arrange a meeting with the full board. We need to apologize. We need to make this right. Pastor Donovan. 3 weeks ago I came to your office with a briefcase full of documentation that would have proven everything I just told you. I was prepared to reveal my anonymous giving and work with the board to address any concerns about transparency. But instead of listening, you accused me of crimes, demanded money from me, and banished me from my own church. Mrs. Calloway, we were trying to follow proper procedures. You didn't realize that your most faithful member might also be your most generous supporter. You didn't consider that the person you were investigating might be the same person who had made your success possible. You were so concerned about democratic governance and accountability that you destroyed the very relationship that had enabled your church to thrive. Pastor Donovan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Calloway, what do you want us to do? What I want, Pastor Donovan, is for you to understand the full scope of what you've lost. Not just the financial support, but the trust and loyalty of someone who devoted her entire life to serving your congregation. Mrs. Calloway, surely we can work this out. The board will apologize. We'll reverse all the decisions we made. We'll welcome you back with full honors. Pastor Donovan, do you know what I've been doing for the past 3 weeks? No. I've been visiting other churches in the area. Beautiful congregations that appreciate faithful service and generous support. Churches that understand the value of anonymous giving and don't treat their volunteers like suspected criminals. Mrs. Calloway, please don't make any hasty decisions. Let us fix this. Hasty decisions, like the hasty decision to reject anonymous donations. Like the hasty decision to ban me from church activities, like the hasty decision to demand that I pay you for improving your programs. Mrs. Calloway, we were wrong. We admit we were wrong. Please tell us how to make this right. I paused, looking out my kitchen window at the autumn morning, thinking about the conversation I'd had with Pastor Williams at First Methodist Church just 3 days earlier. Pastor Donovan, I said, do you remember what you told me 3 weeks ago about donors whose giving was contingent on avoiding accountability? Mrs. Calloway, I was wrong about that. I completely misunderstood the situation. You said that if someone's anonymity was more important to them than supporting the church's mission, then perhaps their motives weren't as pure as you thought. Mrs. Calloway, I realize now that I was completely wrong to say that, and you said that the church would be better off with donors who are willing to work openly within your governance structure. Mrs. Calloway, please, we want to work with you. We value your support more than you know. Pastor Donovan, I want you to know that I've taken your advice. What do you mean? I've found a church that values open, transparent giving within their governance structure, a church that appreciates generous support and treats their volunteers with respect and gratitude. Mrs. Calloway, what are you saying? I'm saying that effective immediately, I am transferring my church membership to First Methodist Church here in Willowbrook Township. Pastor Williams has been incredibly welcoming, and the congregation there seems to understand the value of both faithful service and generous giving. Mrs. Calloway, no. Please don't do this. We can work this out. Pastor Donovan, I'm also calling to inform you that as of today, I am making a substantial financial contribution to First Methodist Church. They're planning a major renovation of their fellowship hall, and I've decided to fully fund the project. Mrs. Calloway, how much are you giving them? $200,000, Pastor Donovan. The same amount I had been planning to anonymously donate to Hillcrest Community Church for your sanctuary sound system upgrade. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Calloway. Pastor Donovan said finally, please reconsider. The congregation at Hillcrest has been your family for 47 years. Don't let a misunderstanding destroy decades of relationship. Pastor Donovan, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. You chose to reject anonymous giving. You chose to treat me with suspicion. You chose to value governance procedures over grateful relationships. You chose to drive away the very person who had made your ministry possible. Mrs. Calloway, the board will meet tonight. We'll reverse every decision we made. We'll publicly apologize for our mistakes. We'll welcome you back with full honors and complete gratitude. Pastor Donovan, do you know what the saddest part of this whole situation is? 3 weeks ago, I would have been content to continue my anonymous giving for the rest of my life. I would have quietly supported Hillcrest Community Church until the day I died, asking for nothing except the joy of seeing my church family thrive. All you had to do was appreciate what you already had. Mrs. Calloway, we do appreciate it. We appreciate you more than we can express. No, Pastor Donovan. You appreciate my money. You appreciate the comfortable facilities and successful programs my giving made possible. But you never appreciated me when you thought I was just a faithful volunteer. You pushed me aside and treated me like a problem to be managed. It was only when you realized I was also your financial benefactor that you suddenly discovered my value. Mrs. Calloway, that's not true. You've always been valued at Hillcrest. Pastor Donovan, 3 weeks ago Jeanne Morrison told me that Queen Beatrice needed to step aside and let other people have a chance to contribute. Last week Harold Morrison demanded that I pay the church $47,000 for being too generous with my own money. Douglas Crawford accused me of financial impropriety for knowing too much about my own donations, and you told me that my anonymous giving was motivated by ego rather than faith. Mrs. Calloway, we were wrong about everything. Please give us a chance to prove that we can do better. Pastor Donovan, I've already given you 47 years of chances. I've given you over $1 million of chances. I've given you my entire adult life of chances. The time for chances is over. Mrs. Calloway, what about the congregation? What about the families who have benefited from your generosity? What about the children who have participated in programs you supported? What about them? Pastor Donovan, where were they when you were investigating me for crimes I didn't commit? Where were they when you banned me from church activities? Where were they when you demanded that I pay for the privilege of having served them faithfully? Mrs. Calloway, they didn't know what was happening. If they had known the truth, they would have supported you, would they? The truth is that the same people who benefited from my anonymous generosity spent the past month gossiping about my finances and speculating that I might be embezzling from the church. The truth is that congregation members were more eager to believe I was a criminal than to appreciate my faithful service. Pastor Donovan was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Calloway, he said finally, what will it take for you to forgive us? And come home, Pastor Donovan. Forgiveness and returning home are two different things. I can forgive the mistakes you made, I already have. But I can't pretend that this experience hasn't shown me exactly how your congregation views faithful service and generous giving. Mrs. Calloway will do anything. Name your terms. My terms are simple, Pastor Donovan. I want you to learn from this experience. I want you to value the volunteers you still have. I want you to appreciate generosity in all its forms, and I want you to remember that faithful service should be rewarded with gratitude, not suspicion. And in return, I'll pray for Hillcrest Community Church and hope that you find your way to a more grateful and welcoming approach to ministry. Mrs. Calloway, please, the congregation needs you. The church needs you. Pastor Donovan, the church needed me 3 weeks ago when you decided to reject everything I had given. It's too late to discover that need now. Mrs. Calloway, at least meet with the board. Let us apologize properly. Let us make amends. Pastor Donovan, I've already heard everything I need to hear. 3 weeks ago, you told me that Hillcrest Community Church would thrive based on the faithful giving of committed congregation members, not on the whims of mysterious benefactors. I'm simply helping you prove that you were right. Mrs. Calloway, we were wrong. We can't maintain current programs without your support. Then perhaps it's time to adjust your programs to match your values. Pastor Donovan, if democratic governance and transparent accountability are more important than generous support, then you should be able to create wonderful programs through committee planning and congregational fundraising. Mrs. Calloway, you're condemning the entire congregation for the mistakes of a few board members. Pastor Donovan, I'm simply redirecting my generosity to people who appreciate it. Just as you recommended. There was another long silence. Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan said, is there anything that would change your mind? I considered the question seriously. After 47 years of faithful service, after 18 years of generous anonymous giving, after a week of systematic humiliation and 3 weeks of investigation for crimes I didn't commit, was there anything that could repair this relationship? Pastor Donovan, I said 3 weeks ago when you were lecturing me about serving with humility and transparency, did you ever consider that I might be the anonymous donor you were rejecting? No, Mrs. Calloway, I never considered that possibility. And why didn't you consider it? Pastor Donovan was quiet for a moment. I suppose because I didn't think you had that kind of money. You didn't think I had that kind of money. Or you didn't think I was that kind of person. Mrs. Calloway, I'm not. Sure, I understand the difference. The difference, Pastor Donovan, is everything. You looked at me, a 73-year-old widow who had devoted her entire life to serving your congregation, and you saw someone who was too old, too controlling, and too poor to matter. It never occurred to you that the sweet lady who arranged flowers and organized potlucks might also be the generous benefactor who had made your ministry possible. Mrs. Calloway, we never thought you were too old or too poor to matter. Didn't you, when Shauna Morrison said I needed to step aside because I was stifling other people's creativity? Wasn't that about my age, when Beverly Patterson suggested I needed to rest because I didn't have the physical energy for complicated tasks? Wasn't that about my age, when you demanded that I pay $47,000 for improving your programs? Wasn't that because you assumed I didn't have real money? Pastor Donovan didn't answer. Pastor Donovan, the truth is that you treated me exactly like most people treat elderly widows, as sweet, harmless, slightly pathetic figures who should be humored and managed rather than valued and respected. It never occurred to you that I might have significant resources, substantial influence, or important contributions to make. Mrs. Calloway, we always valued your contributions. No, Pastor Donovan, you valued my labor. You appreciated having someone who would show up early, stay late, and handle all the tasks that no one else wanted to do, but you never valued my judgment, my experience, or my potential for leadership. And you certainly never imagined that I might be your most important financial supporter. Mrs. Calloway, if you had known I was wealthy, you would have treated me differently. That's exactly the problem, Pastor Donovan. Your respect shouldn't be contingent on someone's bank account. Your gratitude shouldn't depend on how much money someone can contribute. Your appreciation for faithful service shouldn't require financial incentives. Pastor Donovan was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Calloway, he said finally. What you're saying is that we failed you as a church community long before we knew about your financial contributions. Yes, Pastor Donovan. That's exactly what I'm saying. And that failure is why you can't forgive us and come back. Pastor Donovan, I can forgive you, but I can't trust you. And I can't continue to support an organization that views faithful service as dispensable and generous giving as suspicious. Mrs. Calloway, we'll do better. We'll learn from this mistake. I hope you will, Pastor Donovan. But you'll learn without me. There was one final silence. Mrs. Calloway, Pastor Donovan said, "Is there anything else you want to tell me?" I smiled, thinking about the conversation I'd had with Pastor Williams about First Methodist's plans for expanding their community outreach programs. Just one thing, Pastor Donovan. You might want to drive past First Methodist Church sometime this week. They're installing a beautiful new sign announcing their upcoming fellowship hall renovation project. It includes a lovely plaque acknowledging the generous support of their newest member, Mrs. Calloway. You didn't. I did, Pastor Donovan, and unlike my 18 years of anonymous giving to Hillcrest Community Church, this contribution comes with my name proudly displayed for everyone to see. Because Pastor Williams and the congregation at First Methodist understand that generosity should be celebrated, not suspected. Mrs. Calloway, please reconsider. Pastor Donovan. I have one final piece of advice for you. What's that? The next time you have a faithful volunteer who gives generously of their time, energy, and resources, try appreciating them before you lose them. Because once they're gone, all the apologies in the world won't bring back what you've lost. And with that, I hung up the phone. As I sat in my kitchen, finishing my coffee and thinking about the new life I was building at First Methodist Church, I realized that Pastor Donovan had been right about one thing. Hillcrest Community Church would indeed learn to thrive based on the faithful giving of their committed congregation members. They were about to discover exactly what that looked like without the support of their former anonymous benefactor, and I was about to discover what it felt like to be truly appreciated for the first time in 47 years. The sweet old lady who had spent her life being taken for granted was gone forever. The woman who had replaced her was finally free.